Bam!
Your aspirations to hear entrepreneurs, was it because you kind of wanted to do your own business? You were bouncing around? Was it to get some, food for the soul of how do I open a business? What things are they overcoming? How do I get better? Was that kind of the drive at first when you decided you wanted to hear that and then ultimately create that?
It was freedom. I wanted freedom and control of my life. Like, I loved serving my country. I loved being an officer in the Army, but man, I wasn't cut out to take orders for my entire life. I could do it for the time I was in, but not for my whole life. And hey, when you're in corporate finance, commercial real estate, you're taking orders, man. You're taking orders from somebody still. And I just wanted to be the person that was giving myself orders. I wanted to wake up, look at my calendar and say, I put that calendar together. And guess what? I also love the idea of I'm going to make it or break it based off of me, based off of my hard work, my good ideas or lack thereof. But like, I have nobody but myself to look in the mirror and say, you're the reason why you're a success, or you're the reason why you're a failure. And I loved that methodology. I loved not being able to play the blame game about, my boss is this, the economy, that. It was all me.
Yeah. You know what? That's exactly right. You said something that the listeners or viewers need to hear is when entrepreneurs and people that want that freedom, they want that pressure where it is on them. They don't want to have to deal with things they can't control. When you wake up in the morning, you decide if you're going to at least attempt to be successful or not. You are going to decide on how you're going to overcome some issues or you don't. And in the podcast game in 2012, when you started, there wasn't a lot of that there. I'm newer to podcasts, meaning even listening to them. I've probably been listening to them maybe for 2 years. And then I kind of was like, well, I won an Entrepreneur of the Year award and they're like, do a podcast or a book. And I said, I'll flirt around with the podcast. Then it gets addicting. It gets addicting to hear people's stories. It gets addicting to learn from others and share stories. And you get inspired. And you do this show every day, so it's got to be inspiring. But when you first started, I always say there's no elevator in life. You got to take the stairs. You didn't go from, 0 to 20 million. What was the first couple of years like grinding and trying to get people on and building something that's never been built before?
Well, it was a grind because I was nobody. I had no audience. I had no social media presence. It was like I was starting at ground zero. And it's just like you said, it was a step at a time. It was no hockey stick. It was just one step at a time. There are 2 books that I read, The Slight Edge by Jeff Olson and The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy, which gave me confidence that I was on the right path because they both talked so eloquently about how it is just one step. It's just getting a little bit better. And that compounds over time into a lot of success. But man, like, it's just one step at a time. And for me, that was the process. And just saying, you know what, I'm getting a little bit better as a podcast host. My online business is getting a little more robust. My audience is getting a little bit bigger. Like, all these things, I could just kind of look back and just say, this is a slow but steady growth. And that was what I was focused on for the first couple of years of the business. And, that's actually still what I'm focused on as I enter year 9.
That's amazing. So, when you're grinding through, you're not making money up front. You start to build a business around this, I'm assuming, and you continue to grow it. And you bring team members on that can really help elevate your brand because you're building a brand from scratch. Nobody's like, John Lee Dumas, who's this guy at the beginning? Now you've got this thing. People don't realize, whether it's in business, whether it's in social media, whether it's in podcasting, you don't get from A to Z fast. It is slow. And sometimes a lot of people quit because it seems like the journey's too hard because they're not getting that satisfaction too fast. You stayed on it. Were there days that you felt like you needed to quit where you're like, man, I don't know if I'm going to break through and this is going to get any better?
No, because I had the right philosophy. I was reading the right books. I was listening to the right people. And, the reality is this. I love when people quit because that's just them not putting in the work. That's just them not being patient or persistent enough. And guess what? Not everybody can be a winner. Not everybody can succeed in entrepreneurship. And that's okay. Not everybody should. There's a lot of people that should be employee number 37 at Facebook, who, by the way, is worth a lot more than you and I combined and ever will be. It's just they were in the right place at the right time. They were number 37. They put in the work. And, hey, now they're incredibly filthy rich. Good for them. They made it happen. And the reality is this. The higher the barrier, the lower the competition. The higher the barrier, the lower the competition. So if I had just done a weekly podcast, that's not that high of a barrier. It's not that hard to do 4 podcast episodes a week per month. So a lot of people would do it, and a lot of people do that. So I wouldn't have achieved uncommon success if I had just done that. But I said, well, what's a higher barrier? Well, 2 episodes per week is higher. 3 episodes is higher than that. 5 is higher than that. 7's essentially the most. I mean, I don't really know why you would launch more than an episode a day. It'd be interesting. I'm sure you could do it. But I knew that 7 was a barrier that 99.9% of people wouldn't even attempt. And so I was setting the barrier so high that my competition was so low. Like I was the best daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs the day that I launched. I was the worst daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs the day that I launched. I was the only daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs the day that I launched. Like, how can you be the only? And that to me is like where people should be looking at starting at that point. And it's just such a critical thing. And, you know, Jayson, I don't want to make any assumptions about your age, but, you know, we look about the same age here. And, you know, back in the 90s, you know, there was one Blockbuster in town. And if you wanted to rent a movie, you went to that one Blockbuster. If you wanted to listen to a daily podcast, I was the only game in town. I was the only Blockbuster in town. Now, of course, Netflix came in and blew up Blockbuster. And so I've always going to be aware of what's coming to blow me up and try to stay, you know, nimble and adjust and pivot and stay cutting edge. But the reality is that's why I was able to get initial momentum.